The alien mercenaries stood in formation, their armor gleaming under the harsh light of the twin suns. Commandant Vorsh, a hulking reptilian being with scales that shimmered like polished steel, surveyed the canyon below with a practiced eye. His troops were the best money could buy, an amalgam of species from across the galaxy, each one trained to perfection and equipped with the most advanced weaponry known to civilized worlds. Yet, there was an undercurrent of unease rippling through their ranks. The reports about the Deathworlders had been vague, almost absurd in their implications, but Vorsh wasn't one to dismiss rumors entirely. The comms crackled with static as Vorsh barked orders, his voice rough and guttural. "Scan the perimeter. I want no surprises." He glanced at his lieutenant, a wiry insectoid named HFY, whose mandibles clicked nervously. "What do we know about them?" "Very little, Commandant," HFY admitted, his multifaceted eyes glinting. "They operate in small units, rely heavily on unconventional tactics, and appear to have minimal technological support. They shouldn't pose a significant threat." Vorsh grunted, unconvinced. The mercenaries had been routed once before by these Deathworlders, and while the official reports attributed the loss to poor leadership, whispers among the survivors told a different story, one of shadows in the trees, traps that turned the terrain itself against them, and a ferocity that no amount of armor could withstand. Vorsh would not make the same mistake as his predecessor. The canyon stretched wide and barren before them, its jagged rocks casting long, distorted shadows in the setting light. Vorsh had chosen the location carefully, a choke point that would nullify any attempts at flanking. Drones buzzed overhead, their sensors sweeping for signs of movement. All appeared quiet, but Vorsh's instincts, honed by decades of warfare, told him otherwise. Then it began. The first explosion was subtle, a muffled thump that barely registered over the hum of the drones. One of the forward scouts dropped, his armor crumpling inward like a tin can. Confusion rippled through the formation as the mercenaries scrambled to locate the threat. The second explosion was louder, sharper, and accompanied by a cloud of dust and shrapnel that sent 3 more soldiers to the ground. Panic set in as Vorsh shouted for calm, but the battlefield had already turned against them. "They're here," Zach hissed, his voice trembling. Vorsh raised a clawed hand, signaling for the troops to tighten their formation. "Show yourselves, cowards," he roared, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. But the Deathworlders did not emerge. Instead, the air seemed to grow heavier, charged with an invisible tension. The drones began to fail one by one, their feeds dissolving into static. "What's happening to our systems?" HFY shouted, frantically tapping at his wrist console. "Jamming us," Vorsh growled. "Primitive, but effective." He scanned the cliffs, his sharp eyes catching flickers of movement, a shadow too quick to track, a glint of metal here and there. They were being watched, hunted. A scream tore through the air as one of the mercenaries was dragged into the darkness of a narrow crevice, his desperate cries cut short by a sickening crunch. The remaining soldiers closed ranks, their weapons sweeping in all directions, but there was nothing to shoot at. Then they struck. The Deathworlders came like phantoms, emerging from the shadows with a speed and precision that defied belief. Their weapons were crude by galactic standards, projectile-based rifles, blades fashioned from salvaged metals, but in their hands, they were devastating. A towering Deathworlder, his face streaked with mud and blood, leapt from the cliffs and landed among the mercenaries with bone-shattering force. He moved like a force of nature, his blade carving through armor as if it were paper. Another followed, a lithe figure whose movements were almost balletic, dispatching enemies with a fluidity that was terrifying to behold. Vorsh raised his energy cannon, firing a blast that disintegrated a boulder and sent debris raining down. The Deathworlders scattered, disappearing as quickly as they had appeared. He turned to HFY, whose exoskeleton glistened with sweat. "Hold the line. Regroup and—" A sharp crack interrupted him as a sniper's bullet punched through HFY's head, his body collapsing in a twitching heap. Vorsh froze, his eyes narrowing. This was no random assault. The Deathworlders were systematically dismantling his forces, exploiting every weakness with surgical precision. "Fall back," Vorsh roared, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Regroup at the fallback point." The mercenaries began a hasty retreat, their discipline eroding with every step. As they fled, the Deathworlders pursued, their attacks relentless but calculated, designed to sow maximum fear and confusion. Vorsh found himself alone as the retreat dissolved into a rout. His claws dug into the ground as he turned to face the pursuing Deathworlders. His cannon charged for a final stand. A figure emerged from the shadows, a human, clad in ragged but functional armor, his eyes cold and unyielding. Vorsh had faced many enemies in his time, but something about this one, his unwavering gaze, his steady stance, struck a chord of primal fear in the commandant's chest. "You should have stayed away," the human said, his voice calm, almost conversational. Then he charged. The last thing Vorsh saw was the glint of a blade descending, and then there was nothing but darkness. The aftermath of the ambush left the battlefield eerily silent. The mercenaries' corpses lay scattered among the rocks, their gleaming armor now marred by blood and scorched by crude explosives. Hidden among the jagged cliffs, Lieutenant Aidan Kane surveyed the scene through the scope of his rifle. His breathing was steady, his heartbeat unervingly calm despite the carnage below. This was his world, his domain, and every instinct told him the job was far from finished. "Aidan, report." The voice crackled softly in his earpiece, low and measured. Captain Elena Moreau, the unit commander, rarely raised her voice, but when she spoke, every word carried weight. "All clear for now," Aidan replied, his tone as sharp as the chill in the evening air. "They're pulling back, but they'll regroup soon enough. Vorsh is too stubborn to cut his losses." From her position further up the ridge, Elena observed the retreating mercenaries. She leaned into the cover of a boulder, her dark eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of a counterattack. Beside her, Sergeant Malik Ramos adjusted the makeshift sling on his arm, wincing as he tightened it. "They weren't ready for us," Malik said, his grin betraying the pain he was trying to mask. "But they'll be back, and next time, they'll bring more than flashy toys and fancy armor." "They'll bring desperation," Elena corrected, her voice like tempered steel. "And desperate soldiers are dangerous. We've hurt them, but they're not done." Malik nodded, his grin fading. He knew she was right. The mercenaries weren't like the scattered pirate bands they'd crushed before. These were disciplined, well-funded killers, and Vorsh wouldn't rest until he reclaimed his pride, or died trying. "Let them come," Aidan said over the comms. "We'll send them back in pieces." Elena allowed herself a brief smirk. Aidan's confidence bordered on arrogance, but it was rooted in years of hard-earned survival. Like the rest of her team, he was a product of Earth's brutality, honed by its unforgiving landscapes, its relentless predators, and the constant threat of extinction. They weren't soldiers in the traditional sense. They were survivors, and that made them something far more dangerous. The Deathworlder's reputation was no mere exaggeration. They were faster, stronger, and tougher than most species, their bodies conditioned by millennia of evolution to endure extremes that would kill others. But it wasn't just biology that made them lethal, it was their mindset. They didn't rely on advanced technology to solve their problems. They adapted, improvised, and thrived in chaos. It was this combination of resilience and ingenuity that made them a force to be feared across the galaxy. Elena's thoughts were interrupted by a faint rustling sound. She froze, her hand instinctively reaching for the knife at her belt. Malik stiffened beside her, his good hand gripping his weapon. Aidan's voice came through the comms, low and urgent. "We've got movement. Northwest Ridge." Elena tilted her head, listening. The sound was faint but unmistakable, a deliberate shift in the rocks, too heavy to be the wind. She motioned for Malik to stay put and crept toward the edge of the ridge, her movements silent and precise. Below, a small squad of mercenaries was making its way toward their position. Unlike the earlier wave, these soldiers moved with caution, their weapons raised and their eyes scanning every shadow. They were learning, Elena noted, but they were still out of their depth. "5 targets," she murmured into the comms. "Standard formation. They're probing. Aidan, can you take the lead?" "Already lined up," he replied. Elena gave the signal, and a single shot rang out, echoing through the canyon. The lead mercenary dropped instantly, his body crumpling to the ground. The others froze, their nerves fraying as they scanned the cliffs for the unseen sniper. "They'll scatter," Elena whispered. "Malik, be ready." Sure enough, the squad broke formation, their fear overriding their training. 2 of them scrambled for cover, while the other 2 fired blindly into the rocks. Malik grinned despite his injury, raising his rifle and taking aim. The ensuing skirmish was brief but brutal. Elena struck first, emerging from the shadows with a brutal efficiency that left no room for error. Her blade found the gap between a mercenary's helmet and chest plate, and he fell without a sound. Malik's rifle barked twice, dropping another before he could fire. The remaining 2 mercenaries panicked, their movements erratic as they tried to retreat. Aiden picked them off cleanly from his perch, his shots precise and unhurried. When it was over, Elena knelt by one of the bodies, her expression unreadable. She searched the soldier's pack, retrieving a small device that pulsed faintly with light. A quick glance confirmed her suspicion. It was a tracker. "They're marking us," she said, tossing the device to Malik. "They'll be back, and they'll bring more." "Good," Aiden said over the comms. "I was starting to get bored." Elena didn't respond. She pocketed the tracker and stood, her gaze sweeping the canyon below. The battle was far from over, but they had bought themselves a moment's respite. Malik looked at her, his brow furrowed. "What's the plan, Captain?" Elena's lips curved into a grim smile. "We keep doing what we do best. We hit them hard, hit them fast, and remind them why they should fear us." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the canyon into shadow, the Deathworlders melted back into the cliffs. The mercenaries would return, but they would not find a beaten enemy waiting for them. They would find shadows, ghosts, and the unyielding will of those who had been forged in the crucible of a death world. The night was heavy with anticipation, the kind that made even seasoned soldiers question their choices. The Deathworlders had spent the last hours fortifying their position, their movements deliberate and efficient, each member understanding their role without the need for excessive words. Aiden perched on a rocky outcrop, his rifle cradled in his arms, its matte finish blending seamlessly with the jagged terrain. Below, the mercenaries were massing, their numbers bolstered and their resolve hardened by desperation. The air buzzed faintly as their vehicles hummed into position, turret-mounted cannons pivoting toward the Deathworlders' location. "They're committing everything," Malik said, his voice low as he joined Elena behind a natural barricade. His wounded arm was bandaged, but he wielded his sidearm with the steady hand of someone who had seen far worse. "They have no choice," Elena replied, her tone devoid of pity. She peered through her binoculars, her expression hardening as she counted the enemy forces. "This is their last play. If they lose here, they're finished." Aiden's voice crackled through the comms. "Looks like Vorsh brought his best toys. Heavy artillery, combat drones, reinforced armor. They think they can crush us in one strike." Elena's lips twitched into a faint smile. "Good. Let them come." The canyon floor erupted with movement as the mercenaries advanced, their weapons lighting up the darkness in blinding bursts. The Deathworlders didn't flinch. They waited, patient as predators, letting the enemy expend their energy and reveal their weaknesses. The first wave of drones zipped ahead, scanning for targets, their sleek forms glinting under the moonlight. Aiden's rifle spoke first, its sharp crack slicing through the cacophony. One drone spiraled out of control, its engine sputtering before it crashed into the rocks. Another shot followed, then another, each one precise, each one devastating. The mercenaries adjusted their approach, deploying energy shields to protect their advance, but Elena had anticipated this. "Trigger it," she ordered, her voice calm but commanding. Malik grinned as he hit the detonator. A series of explosions rippled through the canyon, the crude mines they'd planted earlier tearing through the front line. Smoke and debris filled the air, and the mercenaries faltered, their formation breaking as chaos spread through their ranks. Elena seized the moment. Now. The Deathworlders descended like a storm. Elena led the charge, her blade flashing as she darted between the enemy lines, her movements precise and lethal. Malik followed close behind, his sidearm barking as he picked off targets with unerring accuracy. Aiden provided cover from above, his rifle never missing its mark. The mercenaries fought back with desperation, their heavy artillery pounding the cliffs and their soldiers swarming in an attempt to overwhelm the Deathworlders through sheer numbers. But for every soldier they sent forward, 2 more fell. The Deathworlders moved as one, their actions seamless, their tactics devastating. Vorsh watched from the command vehicle, his claws digging into the console as he barked orders. "Hold the line. Push them back." But his words fell on deaf ears. His troops were breaking, their morale shattered by an enemy they couldn't comprehend. Elena spotted him amid the chaos, his towering form unmistakable even in the dim light. She motioned to Aiden. "Target acquired. Cover me." "Always," Aiden replied, his voice steady. Elena moved with purpose, cutting through the enemy like a blade through water. Malik flanked her, his injured arm hanging limply at his side, but his resolve unwavering. They reached the command vehicle as the last of Vorsh's guards fell. The commandant stood his ground, his cannon humming with power as he leveled it at Elena. "You think you've won, Deathworlder?" he snarled. "You're just animals, nothing more." Elena didn't blink. "Maybe. But animals survive." Vorsh fired, the cannon's energy beams slicing through the air with a deafening roar. Elena dodged, the heat of the blast searing her skin as it narrowly missed. She lunged forward, her blade striking the cannon's power core. Sparks flew as the weapon sputtered and died. Vorsh roared, his massive claws swiping at her, but Elena was faster. She ducked under his swing, driving her blade into his exposed flank. The commandant staggered, his breath ragged as he fell to one knee. "Mercy," he growled, blood dripping from his jaws. Elena stared at him, her expression unreadable. "Did you show any to the colonies you burned?" Without another word, she withdrew her blade and ended him. The battle was over. The remaining mercenaries fled, their will to fight shattered. Elena stood in the midst of the wreckage, her chest heaving as she surveyed the aftermath. Malik approached, his face a mixture of exhaustion and satisfaction. "Guess that's that," he said, his voice laced with relief. "For now," Elena replied. She looked up at the ridge where Aiden stood, his rifle slung over his shoulder. He gave her a nod, his expression as calm as ever. The Deathworlders regrouped, their victory hard-earned but complete. The mercenaries had underestimated them, as so many others had before. But this was the truth of Deathworlders. They were survivors, forged by a world that demanded nothing less than perfection. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, Elena turned to her team. "Let's move. There'll be more coming, and we need to be ready." They disappeared into the shadows, leaving behind only the wreckage and the whispered terror of their name.